They can now. Hey,
Okay.
folks, thanks for tuning in to the BAMF podcast. I am your host, Mike Lafferty, broadcasting from the palatial BAMF Broadcasting Zeppelin, high above the Rocky Mountain Empire. I'm
Which
here
just
with,
happens to look like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise.
it's a wild coincidence, sir. That's Bob back there in the yellow shirt. He likes to sit out there and stare at the. Anyway,
Could be Bob.
I want to say hi to DM Milkman. Good to see you, sir. Morning to you as well. I can only assume that you are somewhere where it is far earlier than it is here. Today, we are here to talk about the films of Mr. David Lynch, who tragically passed earlier this week. David Lynch is well known for films such as Mulholland Drive, The Elephant Man, Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, Dune, which he wasn't particularly happy with, Lost Highway, The Straight Story, and I think his last movie, I could be mistaken, is The Inland Empire. Also well known for his TV work in Twin Peaks.
And Mulholland Drive was originally going to be a pilot.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. I have to apologize. I forgot to play our contractually obligated intro music. If I can beg your guys' indulgence for just 3 seconds, I will take care of that little chore, okay?
Yeah.
Apologies, folks. My cousin Ernest wrote that song, and I owed him some money from a bad bet in the 90s. And if I don't play that, I get nasty phone calls. So every episode we have to play that. But that is meant to show you that this is a high quality, high professionalism standards kind of podcast. Only the finest farm to table, ethically sourced, gluten free, geeky conversation for your podcast listening pleasure. And for anyone looking for Guy Ritchie conversation, what governor? Terribly sorry. Maybe next week. Because of the death of Mr. Lynch, Owen believed that this was a good time to discuss his work, and I agreed. Now, I will point out that I had trouble finding other panel members for this because it seems David Lynch is one of those directors. A lot of people know of him and appreciate his work, but I couldn't find people who liked him and wanted to discuss him at length. So that was kind of a challenge. So, Owen, I hope you're prepared. You did some stretching and you're prepared to carry a lot of this conversation because
We'll see how it goes.
Okay. So, Jacob, I believe you wanted to talk about Dune.
Indeed. When I was prepping for this and looking back on the catalog of David Lynch and what films I was familiar with, I came to the quick realization that Dune from 1984 is the only one of his movies I have seen. I've seen 4, maybe 5 episodes of Twin Peaks, but when it comes to his films, the 1984 Dune is it. And honestly, to a large degree, it was very influential for me when I was young. I really enjoyed watching it. It had some pretty in-depth lore that I was mildly familiar with because I was also a Star Wars fan, so one did influence the other. And while the 1984 version does deviate quite a bit from the novels, which I have read, I personally enjoyed the 1984 films more than the modern films because, frankly, I think the condensed plot got across the idea of what was happening just fine in the 2.5 to 3 hour runtime that the original film was. I liked the old cast, and I think they got their characters and motivations across far more easily and giving you an idea of who they are more than the modern Dune films. I was watching the modern Dune film, and if I was not familiar with Dune, there are times where I would have been like, what's his motivation? Why is he doing this? Why is Dr. Yui spoilers, why is Dr. Yui betraying the family Atreides? Because they don't go into it until after he's already done it.
Right. Which, it's acceptable to have someone's motivation not be clear the first time they do something if you come back and do it later, especially since Dr. Huey's betrayal was a horrific shock to the Atreides family. So an argument could be made for that. I actually like the David Lynch movie better too, but for me, it's all about the style and the visuals.
The visuals are excellent.
I think David Lynch's visuals were stunning, and he actually helped build those sets, right? He was hands-on with the sets for Dune. And I think, personally, that his ability to have a vision and express that vision is one of David Lynch's greatest strengths. And I realize you guys haven't watched spoilers for a 60-year-old movie. I know that you all haven't watched that many of his movies, but I do not enjoy, for example, watching Eraserhead, because Eraserhead is not my kind of movie. But I find the visual impact and the directing impact of Eraserhead undeniable, right? It gets into my brain and lodges itself there. And I can see that the one shot, right, of that character with his hair up like this, and I can go, oh yeah, that's Eraserhead. There is no doubt in my mind, and it is iconic. I think making things that were iconic was amongst David Lynch's greatest strengths. Mm-hmm. I personally think that there's sort of this difference between, say, Dune and, let's say Elephant Man, and Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive, right?
So they're vastly different films.
Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive, Lynch has claimed that Mulholland Drive has a normal narrative that one can follow, but I don't think anyone believes him. And it was originally going to be a pilot for a television show. And, when you watch Twin Peaks, you can understand how Mulholland Drive could have been a pilot for a television show. And I think Twin Peaks, in many ways, sort of straddles the line between what I see as David Lynch's normal narratives, where you don't have to be breathing through your eyeballs to understand what he's trying to get at, and his more out there conceptual films, which some people like, some people don't. I understand why you had trouble getting people on here. One of the reasons I'm comfortable talking about David Lynch is that I am not in any way a authority on cinema, any cinema whatsoever. So I have no trouble standing up here and showing just how unprepared I am to defend or critique David Lynch. I can only speak about how he impacted me personally. I too, the first David Lynch thing I saw was Dune, and I saw it in the theaters when it first came out. And my family was a family of science fiction nerds, or at least both my parents were. So we had Dune and all of the follow-ups that existed at the time in the house. And as the movie was being advertised, people kept saying to my parents and in places where I could hear that if you hadn't read the book, there'd be no way you'd understand the movie. So I specifically did not read the book until after I saw the movie, because I wanted to go into Inland Empire, sure. Okay, but now tell us what you think about Inland Empire. And we'll put that up on the screen.
Yeah.
I carefully wanted to see if I could understand Dune without having read the book, and I had no problem following it whatsoever. It does, of course, very specifically put some science fiction content of a very physical nature in the place of some very philosophical stuff. And I think that made it easier to understand as a movie. I get where that might be disappointing to fans who want something more book accurate, and I can see why a lot of people like the two-part movie that we have gotten most recently, which also has beautiful cinematography. But my favorite part of that is that you get a Thufir who's wandering around with an umbrella, a parasol, to keep the sun off him, because the actor was wandering around with a parasol because it was hot where they were filming, and the director said, "That's great, keep that for your character." But I think what David Lynch really wanted to do was create his specific vision, his impact, and show it to people. I presume we all know the story that George Lucas was a fan of Eraserhead and wanted David Lynch to direct Jedi.
I've heard that, yeah.
I'm not familiar with that. No.
So, David Lynch talks about it, right? David Lynch took a meeting. His agent told him, it's George Lucas. You have to take a meeting if he wants to talk to you about it. And Lucas wanted him to direct Jedi, and so David Lynch had George Lucas talk to him about what that movie was about. And to David Lynch, it all sounded like gobbledygook, and he had no interest in doing it whatsoever. And from David Lynch's point of view, he convinced George Lucas to be the director of Jedi because George Lucas clearly had a specific vision of what he wanted. And of course, Lucas didn't direct Empire. So it was not a foregone conclusion that he was going to be the director for Jedi. And I think that conversation really speaks to what David Lynch saw as the point of making television and movies. And he wrote books as well. He was very, very creative. He studied art prior to all of this, for example. So I think part of what Jedi became needs to be laid at David Lynch's feet for Lynch saying, no, I don't want to make the movie. It sounds like what you want. And of course, it was after that Lynch comes along and makes Dune. And I don't know how many people really realize that he wrote the screenplay for Dune, right? So he took this very dry, no pun intended, very philosophical book and re-envisioned it as what he wanted to see with these concepts. And I still think it is amongst the most visually impressive movies that we've had. And he signed up to do 3 movies for De Laurentiis, who was the producer. And one of them was supposed to be a sequel to Dune. But Dune was, at the time, a flop. Made like a half or a third of its budget in its entire run. But I think it has become a much more cult classic. And I think a lot of the reason it is a cult classic is the Lynchian connection of how it is done, and maybe the fact that we've had like 8 versions, which only the theatrical version is the version that was ever done by David Lynch, although his first cut was 4 hours long. I personally would love to see his first cut as a finished film sometime. But
didn't they have that on Sci-Fi Network a few years back?
So they've got longer cuts, but those are all done by people with no input from Lynch.
Okay. Yeah, the Ice Capades version of Dune is probably my favorite, but that's another podcast. They didn't know how to market that movie, I don't think. When I went to go see it in the east side of Minneapolis, there was a guy out front handing out a page of Cliff Notes.
Yeah.
Front and back with, these are the characters, these are the planets involved, here's the gist of the plot. And I got that, and I mean, at the time I was 10 or 11, and I'm watching the movie, and I'm like, why? This wasn't necessary. They just assumed the audience in Indiana, or maybe it's just an Indiana thing, but they just assumed we were too stupid to follow the through line of the plot, and I didn't think it was that complicated.
I don't think it was that complicated either. I don't think anyone who watches Star Wars, for example, which just says, here's Chewbacca. He's a Wookiee. Why is he hanging around with Han? Why can Han understand what he's saying and he can understand what Han's saying, but Chewbacca can't speak? That's not explained in the movie anywhere, and no one had problems with it. Yeah. You've got a senator and an empire, and then the Grand Moff, which is an imaginary title, is in charge, but Darth Vader is the one who seems to be the real badass. None of that is explained in Star Wars, and I don't think it needed to be. I think people freaked out because it was made by the guy that made Eraserhead, and that they had not really understood that Star Wars had changed what science fiction was going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
That's fair.
No, that continued through into the home video market. My father was doing a home video rental business during that time, and when the videos came out, each one came with a little booklet, and that you could open up, and it would have, what's a Sardaukar, who is the Padishah Emperor, it was all in there, and it's like, and I had watched the movie before I found that little booklet, and I was like, I didn't need any of this. They were assuming the audience was stupid.
Yeah, I really think that was part of the problem with the movie.
And I was a 7-year-old, and I could follow it just fine.
It'd be nice if Sex and the City came with, if that happened for all shows, like Sex and the City. This is Carrie Bradshaw. She's not a very nice person, but you figure that out over the course of 3 seasons. Her friends are kind of terrible, but you just anyway.
Well, and if you go to a movie and they hand you that, I mean, first of all, if you're standing in line to see that movie and they hand you this, and you're like, oh well, if I have to read all this to appreciate the movie, screw it, I'm going to see whatever else was out in 1984, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot out that year.
Yeah, it was a big year.
I would like to acknowledge Tim Smith. Thanks for watching, Tim. Says, just read David Lynch's Inland Empire Explained. Amazon, amazing book. Never thought I would find out where AXXONN came from. Book from 1928. Incredible. I am assuming I would have had to see the movie to understand that reference. Have you seen that movie, Owen?
No, that one I have not.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to have to see it. So, well, the one I have seen is Wild at Heart with Laura Dern and Nicolas Cage. Which at the time got a ton of criticism for sexual and violent content. Almost got an X rating here in North America, and I mean, at the time it did push the boundaries, but it's kind of what struck me most about it, and it was very intentional. There's a lot of allusions to Wizard of Oz in there.
Yes.
And it's really a story about people trapped in kind of a violent, hellish situation, finding love. And I don't know, I really enjoyed it. Again, sort of like Dune, it had a very specific vibe to it, very specific look and production. Sydney Barrett says, Inland Empire and Wild at Heart aren't available in Canada. Well, that's a bummer. Okay.
Well, and Wild at Heart is based on a book. So again, it's adapted from a book, and Lynch put all of the Wizard of Oz allusions in on purpose, as far as I have ever been able to determine, just to add Wizard of Oz vibes, right? He was not necessarily trying to suggest that it was more Wizard of Oz like than the book had made it sound. That was just part of what he wanted to do with the movie.
Okay.
I do want to, in defense of Dune, I just looked up what the movies were that were out. It was a Christmas 84 movie. Mm-hmm. And it was up against the first Beverly Hills Cop, 2010, the first Terminator, Missing in Action, Oh God, You Devil, which may sound ridiculous, but the Oh God, that's the third Oh God movie,
huge.
And those were Burns.
Can you imagine putting George Burns to a Gen Alpha kid, or even a millennial? But
it was big at the time. And Starman, and The Cotton Club, and Night of the Comet.
Those were some major films,
right? And Dune only got into 975 theaters, whereas Beverly Hills Cop was in 2,000. 2010 was in 1,200. Terminator 1,100. City Heat 1,600. Missing in Action 1,200. So I feel like that nervousness about that movie worked from the creators of the movie, right, from the studio, worked against it quite significantly. And yet it's considered a flop at 21 million, and the original Terminator is considered a huge hit at 28 million, and that has got to be about their budget. I haven't looked it up, but Dune must have a higher budget than Terminator. And of course, Terminator is set in, at that time, the modern day, so you don't have to build a set for absolutely everything.
Yeah. And going back to the other thing I've seen from Lynch, being the few episodes of Twin Peaks, I think the reason why I couldn't continue with it is because I knew a little too much about it going into it. I never watched the original broadcast, so I watched it later when it became available on streaming. But of course, by that time, I had known some of the behind the scenes, like he didn't have any idea of who the murder plot that the entire show was supposed to be based around was. That was just the MacGuffin to get all the things happening in the show.
Well,
he actually had no plot around that.
Lynch wrote and directed the Twin Peaks, mostly prequel, slight sequel, Fire Walk with Me, which at the time didn't do any business at all, but has actually, again, sort of become a cult classic. And Twin Peaks had such an impact that, they did a third season of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like more than a decade, maybe more than 20 years. Let's see, when was
it was recent. It was incredibly recent. It was within our streaming lifetime.
So 2017. So the second season of Twin Peaks ends in 1990. So 27 years later, they do a third season.
Mm-hmm.
And the first season of Twin Peaks only had 8 episodes. The second season had 22. The third season had 18. And that is, I think in many ways, that tells you a lot about David Lynch's ability to make things that stick with people, right? I never would have guessed that was going to get a third season. And I was working at Paizo, where there are a number of Twin Peak fans, in part because it was around that area that it was filmed. I have been to the cafe that was the cafe for Twin Peaks, and I've had their coffee and pie. Having another season that much later and having so many people glom onto it was just kind of amazing, that it still drove that many people.
Mm-hmm.
And after it, there were people talking about the possibility of a fourth season. I am guessing now that won't happen, but
yeah.
And David Lynch and Mark Frost wrote all the episodes, and Lynch directed, so they're coming back to something 25 years after they've looked at it and doing it as a continuation with most of the original cast returning. It's just sort of stunning to me that and other shows have done that, but I think again all of those shows are cases where someone has made something that sticks in people's heads and they just can't get rid of it.
Well, like Full House.
Yeah. Red Dwarf, right? There are other shows that have done it.
Sorry, I was trying to be funny. Forgive me.
You're not wrong. The Full House has had a huge impact on an entire generation of viewers, and certainly Red Dwarf has as well.
I was a big fan of Red Dwarf.
So much so that many moons after Red Dwarf ended, they brought it back, and
right. Yeah,
they're still having fun with it.
Well, hey, Owen,
yeah.
I'm going to jump in and steer the conversation.
Do that.
Since you mentioned Paizo, and since we are ostensibly an RPG adjacent podcast,
yep,
and we are all guys working in the RPG industry in one capacity or another, how would you bring the signature Lynchian vibe to your tabletop experience if you wanted to?
I think the way to do that, I think the important part of the Lynchian vibe is having a clear vision and expressing it, even if that seems weird. So I don't think that you need to specifically look at Fire Walk with Me or Eraserhead or Mulholland Drive and say, I want that specific feel. Because if you are not someone who has a Lynchian vision, I think it's a mistake to try and create one. But I think that it is proof that if you have a singular vision, if you have a strong feel for what a world should look like and sound like and feel like and even taste like, you can bring those into a campaign setting, sometimes with just little touchstones, right? Going with Twin Peaks, because we were mentioning it. The Log Lady is a weird character, but they are a character that isn't just there. They do drive the plot forward sometimes. And of course, sometimes there's no plot to drive forward with David Lynch. I think there can be games where the entire point is to simply explore this weird world and see how the players react to whatever they run into. One can make a case that an exploration game or a social game could have a much easier time focusing on Lynchian type elements than something that is designed to be a combat-focused game. Although there is nothing preventing you from having combat-focused games with weird stuff that you throw at people just to have a weird vibe. You could even, if you wanted to, have a things being weird and Lynchian and odd be a clue that they are all connected somehow. And those are all ways that you can tie those elements through people. Mark Frost has a couple of books that are great reads. The List of Seven is a great Sherlock Holmes pastiche, only read originally due to the Twin Peaks connection.
And that's from Mr. Sean Vera, who was a frequent viewer, and he's been on the podcast a few times. So thanks for chiming in, Sean. Appreciate that.
And I think, David Lynch was clearly a spectacular world builder. And I think if you want to take away anything from a gaming point of view, it is to not be afraid to stick things in your games that aren't just like what everyone else has already done.
Yeah, the social aspect of Lynch is certainly what people should be looking at for inspiration in their game, because the social interactions are key. With what I've seen of Dune, it's all about social and political discussion and manipulations, and certainly with Twin Peaks, with its incredibly melodramatic acting.
I mean, I've been gaming since '84, so since the year that Dune came out, and I have been gaming with some of the same people since about that time, which means that I can see what they remember from games I ran 10, 15, or 20 years ago. And frequently it's the weird little stuff that people remember. I did a game where very specifically at one point they were in a foreign land where it was considered dangerous to wake powerful people suddenly, and being player characters, they were seen as powerful people. So anytime they were going to be awoken by the staff of this place they were staying in, they would literally come up with a 10-foot long pole that had a little pillow at the end and start gently tapping them on the face with the pillow, which was, of course, incredibly annoying and a really frustrating way to get woken, but that was normal. Most of my players don't remember much of anything else about that game. What they remember is this little oddity of having people with a 10-foot long pole with a pillow going.
Usually the things I remember from your games were the foods you made up.
I do a fair amount of food stuff. It's true. What are you thinking of?
That nasty concoction that you eventually actually presented to us when you did a night of Owen's game food. It was like it was cottage cheese with Sprite in it.
Well, it wasn't just that. You are, in fact, thinking of the fermented goat's milk, which was a famous drink from one of the lands in the game I ran. And to simulate it, we mixed cottage cheese, Sprite, buttermilk, and Italian dressing. And Jacob, I offered people 50 experience points if they would take a sip, and Jacob was one of the people who did.
A sip. Ew.
I
love that game, though. It was the Middle Kingdoms. It was great.
I was once aware of a LARP where they decided to make the healing potions as disgusting as possible. And the one variation I heard of was brine shrimp, Gatorade, and vegetable oil.
I was in a LARP, the International Fantasy Gaming Society, IFGS, and at one point, part of our loot was incredibly rare wine, and my character took that loot because it was a hot day, and I popped it open, and a whole bunch of staff were trying to get me to not drink it because it was a mix of grape juice, cream soda, I think, and Diet Coke. So they were trying to make it the nastiest thing possible. But it was cold, and I was hot, so I drank a lot of it. But again, what we're talking about here is how memorable the weird stuff can be. And I think that is an important takeaway from looking at how Lynch went from being 50 experience. No, just 50. Let's get real here. It's not like you're killing a rat. I think that Lynch managed to create things that were memorable and felt iconic, but didn't feel like they were built on anything that had come before. And that is part of what made him so memorable and so iconic.
Maybe I don't want to sound pretentious when I say that, but having preambled it that way, it's probably inevitable. I mean, a lot of things, movies are bound by tropes. And I mean, my brain is always going, okay, I've seen this before. This is what happens next. Now this is what happens. Now, I'm doing the math as I watch it. And with directors who have a unique vision and who throw in some stuff you don't expect, it sticks with you more.
I think that's very valid.
Yeah, and I think you have that danger, if you want to call it danger. And I was talking to a publisher, a friend of mine, on Discord, and he was like, the thing is, when you get right down to it, everyone wants to play a variation on the same fantasy game they've been playing for 40 years. And the challenge as a professional in the field is, how do you do something that is creatively satisfying for you, but still finds an audience and still sticks out enough so it's not just another, take on, the same fantasy role-playing game, with just a little different enough to make someone buy it.
I mean, I had a publisher tell me who did D20 fantasy stuff, who told me he was incredibly frustrated because he felt everyone just wanted elves and he didn't want to do elves. And so my response to him was, if you were to do elves, how could you make elves something that you would find interesting? So he went and did that. He made elves that he thought were interesting, and it sold better than most of his products because people want elves, but they also frequently, you can find an audience for something that's new and different. It's just that if instead of calling them elves, right, you call them amateur, then people are like, well, that doesn't mean anything. I have no starting point to connect to that.
Yeah, you got to have enough of a framework to work from. But I mean, that's one reason I switched to doing more zine and shorter stuff, is because you can experiment more. If you want to do a book about cocaine owlbears, it's 30 pages long. Yeah, as an example, and it finds an audience or it doesn't, but it's 30 pages long. You shell out for art, and it's fun, it's interesting, and you go on to the next project. If you do a 300-page book where you sketch out the ecology of cocaine owlbear and the world built around cocaine owlbear, and you develop, a spellcasting system based off, narcotics, and it's a lot of time, and a lot of tropes put into that, and so I tend to go towards shorter stuff just because it's more satisfying. And sometimes, like with cocaine owlbear, I don't want to even work that into every podcast, and I promise I won't. But just as a handy example,
No, it's actually a great example, but it's also a great example of something that seems weird and wacky and connected with folks, right?
Yeah.
There weren't, even when I was looking at that trope, that cocaine bear trope, the direction I went was to create the trippin' balls template to put on anything. Mm-hmm. I did not come up with cocaine owlbear, even when I was sitting there from a very similar starting point as you and trying to do something to tie into it. No one is all excited. Well, maybe not no one. There's not a group of people who are all excited about the Trippin' Balls first edition Pathfinder template. But there are a bunch of people that got excited about cocaine owlbear because it was a singular vision that they understood where it came from, but it did something different than anything else that they had absorbed at that point.
So maybe that's the takeaway there. I feel like we've run this conversation as far as it can run. Maybe I'm wrong. Do we have additional thoughts on David Lynch or something else you want to explore here?
I would recommend. I would just like to take a moment to recommend that people, if you've never seen any David Lynch, at least look at the 84 Dune and Mulholland Drive and the Elephant Man and Eraserhead, right? Look at what those seem to be and pick the one of those that sounds closest to something you would enjoy and give it a try. And if you like all of them, then you like David Lynch, because those are four very, very different movies.
That is fair. Jacob, any closing thoughts?
I think it's amusing how much Kyle MacLachlan shows up in David Lynch films and shows, because he was in the 1984 Dune, he was in Blue Velvet, he was in all of Twin Peaks, so I can only imagine they were friends at the very least, or enjoyed working with each other. So.
And Haley says, I really liked Lynch's Dune. I hope people reevaluate. I hope so too, because nothing else. I really enjoy the production design and the vibe. It's cheesy to point out that Toto did the soundtrack, but I think it's a really
the soundtrack was great.
Yeah, I would agree. So, Well, hey, we've been enjoying doing these movie chat shows. I want to mention that, hey, from Sean Barrett, highlight of our moving statement on his friend's passing. Oh, we should look that up. Thank you for putting that out, Sean. We are doing a kaiju movie show on February 7th, same time. That's 8 o'clock Mountain. Stan will be joining us. So that should be a good time. I look forward to that show. And we'll probably work in Guy Ritchie in the next week or two, but we haven't solidified a date on that yet. Terry says, for anyone
we're not just going to say next week.
We could do next. I don't know if you guys are available next Saturday.
Well, I had bugged out of Guy Ritchie saying I didn't have a lot to say about it. So
you had bugged out of Guy Ritchie? I thought you wanted to do Guy Ritchie. Okay.
I don't have it. I am sitting here doing David Lynch as best I can, but I don't object to Guy Ritchie. I just don't have any insights.
I love Guy Ritchie films.
If we change it more generally to heist movies, could you hang with that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We can do that. Terry says, for anyone whose tastes run more mainstream, I feel Dune and Elephant Man are a good choice, but all 4 Owens listed are awesome. All right. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree with Terry that Dune and Elephant Man are more mainstream. I sort of feel like Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive are sort of iconically Lynch.
Yeah.
I can see that. All right. So next Saturday, 8 o'clock, we're going to call the show Son of a Bitch, I'm In. And we're going to be talking about heist movies. So.
Fair enough.
Oh, Terry, Guy Ritchie is awesome. Rock and roll is underrated. I understand.
It is.
Under people's radar, kind of like The Gentleman. Which kind of came and went during COVID. And new guy, Tony L. Barber says, Mulholland Drive and the entire TP franchise are my favorites, but ... He's keeping us in anticipation.
And now we all wait for whatever else he's going to say.
Elephant Man is amazing. It taught me how to treat people, how to look at people. It was truly powerful.
Elephant Man is an amazing, powerful film. It really is.
I might have to see Elephant Man now. Goddamn. Okay. Where are you? Is this on Amazon? I'm sure I can find
Elephant
it.
Man?
Yeah. It'd be hilarious if Disney Plus owned that now too.
Let's see. Elephant Man is not currently streaming as far as I can tell.
Yeah, the Plex channel. I don't know what that is.
Okay.
I've never heard. Oh, Canopy. Okay. Canopy is an app you can get with your public library card in the United States, and you can watch it there. So that's Canopy with a K.
Plex is a free ad-driven streaming channel that I frequently find in hotel rooms when I'm out at cons.
Okay, that's real. We should start our own streaming service. Everyone else is doing it. Terry says Canopy is amazing. I've got the app on my phone. I've been meaning to use it for like a year because I'm going to the library a lot for the 3D printer. I should really check it out. Well, Heart doesn't get enough love from newer DL fans, LOL. But I love it. I also like it, sir. So, all right, so I'm going to boot up Canopy and watch Elephant Man after this. So hopefully it'll be a better part. Well done. So, all right, and 7 days. We'll be talking about heist movies. Ocean's 11, The Italian Job, both the good one and the one with Mark Wahlberg, and the
Ocean's 8.
Ocean's 8, maybe the most recent D&D movie, which seemed to follow the heist movie structure. And actually, I think you can make an argument a lot of fantasy role-playing game plots are heists. But that's a discussion for next week. So
sounds good.
All right, folks. Thanks for checking us out here on the BAMF podcast. We will check you out next time. See ya.
Bye.